From the New York Times Learning Network, I'm Ross Flatt. Welcome to our Teaching Project Newsroom panel covering the protests. Today, we'll be discussing the Times' coverage of the unrest that has reached nearly every part of our country since the death of George Floyd. We'll hear about the earliest days of the unrest from one of our reporters who is on the ground in Minneapolis, and we'll talk to the team behind the Times interactive piece, How Black Lives Matter Reached Every Corner of America. Joining us today remotely are four guests: Audra Burch, National Enterprise Correspondent; John Elligan, National Correspondent covering race; Morrigan McCarthy, National Photo Editor; and Dawn Tsai, Graphics Multimedia Editor. What I'd like to do first is, John, you were on the ground covering the initial protests as they came out. So I wouldn't mind starting with you, if you could just kind of talk to us about your experience starting to cover this story.
Yeah, so, initially the first couple of days, I covered it from afar, because when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and I'm based out of Kansas City, so not a very long flight away, but partially because of COVID, we've been reporting more so from our homes and trying to, limit our travel. So the first couple of days with Audra, we teamed up to, write stories and really, and the challenge is obviously, yeah, you're not necessarily on the ground, seeing what's happening, but we did have a colleague there who's a freelancer who works for us sometimes, who was kind of going out and getting a sense of what was happening. But the important thing, I think, the important thing that challenges you to really ask the right questions and get at the heart of what's going on. I think oftentimes when you're on the ground and you're in the middle of a protest, it's easy to just kind of see the sometimes chaotic scenes that play out at protests and kind of miss the central message. So I think, in some ways covering this from afar at the beginning really helped us to home in on what the issues were that people were talking about and what was really animating and motivating people. And eventually, a couple days in, I think it was George Floyd was killed on a Monday, and I think it was on that Friday that I went out there. And I went out there to some of the protests, and even then, it was at this point where you really had this boiling over, where you had essentially protests that were going on, and as the night went on, you had some elements, some people who got in there who were not necessarily there for protests, but were there to kind of clash with the police, and so things got kind of, got very heated, I should say. There were, buildings burning and things like that. But I think one of the important takeaways for me, and what I did in one of the stories that I sent along for you all to read, is that, while we do talk about this clash and then this tension on the streets when it comes to the police and people who are out there, it's important to differentiate like protesting versus folks who are there to kind of rouse and cause destruction. And I think that that's really one of the lessons from Ferguson that we bring forward to this point. I think during Ferguson, when those protests happened, we did not in the media do as good of a job, I think, of differentiating between some of the violence and stuff that broke out versus, what was kind of just, legitimate protests. And I think in this time, we're being more shrewd about that, not just us in the media, but if you look at public officials and people who are talking about it, there was this sense of like, we need to make sure that people who are here not to protest don't like overtake the message. So that's a really important thing in terms of being precise in terms of what you're covering.
And that actually brings me to a question a lot of the teachers asked. Judy Freeman, she's a history teacher at the Boston Latin School, and a few other folks asked that question about not just, differentiating between all of the different parties that were there, but around the terminology itself. So, what is called a protest versus a riot versus unrest, and how do you, and I guess really how does the Times sort of think about that language in this context?
Yeah, I mean, you have to be extremely careful with it, right? And some of it is, just talking with your editor. Some of it is like personal preference. Like, I hate saying peaceful protest because that makes it the default. Like, there's some expectation that protests will not be peaceful. So like, you're just saying peaceful. I personally hate using that term, and I try to avoid it at all costs in my stories. I say protests, And I think the term violence is also can be a loaded one that I think about that a lot, because when I think about violence, I think about, harm to people, like people like, hitting someone else or shooting someone else, not necessarily like, not to condone, the burning of a building, but that's kind of that's more vandalism and whatnot. So I think unrest is kind of a broad term we use, because I think you can have unrest that is both, the results and then of protests that are spirited, that are vigorous, but they're going to be a little bit restless, right? Because people are protesting the killing of many times unarmed Black people in the streets by people who are licensed by the state, right? So to imagine that would not be a little bit restless, that's fine for it to be restless. So I mean, when you talk about unrest, to me, unrest kind of captures this general, very broad terminology of protests or demonstrations in the street that may get a little bit passionate, may get maybe some of those passions may overflow a little bit, and I think we have responsibility as specific as possible when it comes to talking about when, yes, there is vandalism, there is burning, there's looting going on, and it's okay to call that out, but you have to be very specific about it happening and about the context in which all of that happens.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for myself, when I was just even like building the slide deck for this and naming the panel, I was kind of going back and forth myself between what to call it. And I know the teachers who are, I'm sure, going to be talking about this, day one of the school year are kind of thinking about the different language that they want to be using.
Ross, I think Ross?
Yeah, go ahead, Audra.
I think the other thing we want to keep in mind is the scale. And so when we talk about protesters versus those who are looting or are doing vandalism, those are almost always a much smaller group. And so when we're covering these stories, we want to make sure that our writing is reflecting the scale of it, that it's a small group that's doing this versus the larger group that's protesting. I think it's very important because it signals to the reader, it's a larger message, and we want to make sure we're sending the right and responsible message in our coverage.
That's definitely a good point. And I think it's a good segue into like that idea of scale. I think is a good segue into into this next part, and that is on this interactive that kind of really captures this, to say the least. So I'm interested to know. So I would just love to hear from Audra, from you, Audra, what was the choice to sort of go about, creating this? Why wasn't it just sort of like an article listing it, or maybe like a collage of photos? What was the genesis of this?
So I would back up a little bit and say that, what we know is that the death of George Floyd on this Minneapolis street really opened up the nation to these exceptionally difficult conversations about race. And so those protests, what we saw was people who were protesting against racism, and they were protesting against injustice, and they were protesting against police brutality or over-policing in African-American communities. And that, I think, is that was the cradle, if you will, of these protests. And I think it was important that we, and John and I had been talking about this because we had been interviewing the protesters, that we really needed to get at the scale of this movement. And it felt like the best way to do that in so many ways was the marriage between, these beautiful visuals, powerful visuals, this really powerful data, and then marrying those with words. So I did the word part, but the photos and the data was already happening, and they did a tremendous job. So what I was really just trying to do is, in the word part of it, was to capture the sense of both the injustice, to capture the sense that pain is never shared equally, but in some ways also that you can't protest without hope. You have to have hope that these things are going to result in some sort of enduring change.
And I think that comes across really well. I before we go into the data and the images, I do want to ask you a little bit more about the words. So we have a ton of English teachers who've joined us today. And, a lot of the teachers asked about your choice in how you approached this writing. A lot of people said, and I agree, that a lot of the words in this article sort of ring like poetry in a lot of ways. And so what was your choice for crafting it in that way?
Well, when we had the discussion with the editors about what we wanted this to be, I think we were clear from the very beginning that this would not be what you would define as a traditional news story. That we were, marrying these words to this, really powerful images as well as data that we have. And so I approached it as an essay about this moment in time, and taking all of the information we had and trying to stitch it together in a way that that tried to get at the emotion of what we were seeing. None of these pictures, none of these images, as you can see, none of them are flat. And so neither could the words. That was certainly my thinking about it, that I wanted the words to be as alive as the photos themselves.
I think that was a really good choice. And when you scroll through the piece, your words come up and then they sort of disappear for a while, and you kind of get to reflect on what you said and look at these images, and then it comes back to the photos, and then we see more of the scale. I think it all worked. So let's talk a little bit about the photos. So Morgan, could you just tell us a little bit about sort of what your role on this project was? And I think it would be helpful too if you could talk just a little bit about the process of photo editing and what your role is.
Sure. So typically photo editing at the New York Times is a little bit more about assigning particular photo stories and figuring out who the right photographer is for the right story, and then working with them through that process, and then working with the reporters as well to make sure that the photos support the text and enhance the story. In this case, it was a little bit different because what we really needed to show was scale. And we obviously don't have photographers in every single one of these towns and cities across America. So the way that my role played out here was much more as a gatherer and a sorter of photography, and in helping to source some of this. So we had an insane spreadsheet that I'm sure we'll talk about at some point that Dawn put together that crashed all of our computers, I think. But through that, we were able, with the help of several news assistants and I think everybody on the project pitched in at some point, just looking for images on social, on the internet, looking for images through other news organizations, and then through the wires. And some of it is our own photography, original photography, but by and large, part of what makes this project so unusual is we were really reaching out to this network of people on the ground who were actually there and asking for their help.
So one question that a lot of teachers had, and this came up in some discussions yesterday, is the role of more local newspapers and local journalists in this, because this was, when you go into sort of like the bottom of this, where you see all of this, the cities and the towns, what was it like working with these other areas? What was the process in choosing, like what would make it into this article? People were curious about that.
Sure. So the first thing we did was we had a list that was compiled of all of the protests that we knew about, and that list kept growing. Like, I think up until the very last minute, it just kept expanding, and we would search for local publications first in these places for the most part. And in my job, every once in a while, we do get to work with other local publications, and it's always kind of a joy because they're the experts in their particular field. We're sort of generalists at photography on the national desk, and it's nice to get to collaborate with people who really know their communities and understand them. So in this case, it was basically, you know, we reached out to them and asked them if they had pictures they could share, or sometimes if we had seen pictures already that we loved, we'd say, can we have that particular one? It was great. It was really fun to get to try to find a place. Like here on the upper left of your screen, you can see Hawaii. There were so many incredible pictures from Hawaii that came out because people do these surf out sort of protest style. And it was really neat to see how each individual community brought their distinct, you know, sense of self to these protests. I think that was one of the things that made this project really impactful.
Yeah, I hope I have the terminology right. Am I seeing like lays in the water?
Yeah, probably. There were
Yeah.
flowers, yeah, in the water.
Wow. I have one more question for you that a lot of people asked you specifically, Morgan. How did you and the team choose what pictures to include? I'm sure going through these thousands and thousands of pictures is, you know, they're all your babies in some way, right? Like it's just, how do you choose what goes in and what doesn't?
I actually think in this case, and really in all of the stories that we do, one of the things that John said really applies, that you want to make sure that you're capturing the actual message and not getting caught up in the spectacle. So one of the things that we were very careful about was making sure we showed a good balance of photos that that accurately portrayed the way that these protests played out around the country. They weren't all looting, and they weren't, you know, violent in large part. And so we wanted to be sure that we had a couple photos of the police interacting with protesters, but that for the most part they showed, you know, accurate representations of what the majority of the protests were like. So that was one consideration. We also, you know, we were looking for different sizes of scale. We were looking to make sure we had a representation of some very, very small towns that you might not expect would have protests, and some of the big places that made the news every night. And so it was really looking for a variety. And then also because this just had so many photos, I think one of the things that we tried hard to do was to make it so it wasn't repetitive. There was a sense of repetition because you do want to just see the protests over and over, and that's part of what gives it the impact. But you want to make sure that visually you're giving people some different things to look for and kind of grasp onto. And the final thing, which actually turned out to be a real pain, was you know, we don't show profanity in the Times, and a lot of these protests, the signs, there were some signs that the Times deemed inappropriate. So we got those rules shifted a little bit for this project, but there was a lot of very close inspection and zooming in on photos to figure out what we could even run.
That, yeah, I was thinking about that when I was dragging pictures into this slide deck. I came across a couple signs. I was like, I wonder what the standards were around this.
There were discussions.
So let's talk a little bit more about those discussions. Dawn, I want to turn things over to you. So, Dawn, what I'd like if you could to sort of speak a little bit about your process, like going into a collaborative effort like this. So if you could just tell us a little bit more about your role and you know, do you have a vision of how you want the graphics to function on the outset? What's your process?
So my role for this project is I did a little bit of everything. I did a little bit of the data collection. I did a little bit of the map development. I did a little bit of design. So overall, my role is more like a design developer for this project. And I kind of want to backtrack a little bit to talk about like an earlier iteration of this project, which we published more like a breaking news feature right after the first weekend of the protest, which is a pretty simple page with a big map on top with dots of cities had protests of like to the first weekend, and just full screen pictures, one picture of each city. And that project went pretty well, and people noticed that we are tracking where the protests were happening. And what happened was, over the coming week, people on Twitter and on email and reaching out to us and be like, you missed my city, you missed this city. And we found there are people who's actively tracking where the protests are happening. So going back to that crazy spreadsheet, some of our tips come from social media, where people are collecting where the protests were happening, and some come from other databases, some come from our own reporting. And we have a team of maybe 4 or 5 people collecting those cities, and the list just grows day by day. And how we verify is we found the city had a protest, so we go back to search for local media and to see if we can verify with report. And what we included is all the protests that had people showed up, more than 100 people showed up. So we want to have protests that's to a certain scale that could be called a protest. So that is a big collaborative effort with just keep this spreadsheet up to date and with all the information we might need. And after we seeing there are so many cities, and we start to think what is the sort of project that would make justice and show the true scale and how unprecedented this movement is. So we're going back to think about photos as the most direct way. And the organization of this story took a little bit, I think, at first. If you can go back to the first the sketch we did. One thing that jumped out to us when we were doing the research is there are tiny little towns with over maybe 5,000 people, but hundreds of people showed up for protests, and cities with names we never heard of. And for us, that is one of the most interesting things. So at first we thought we could group this project by city sizes. We show all the small cities had big protests. We show medium sizes cities. Then we show huge cities, because New York having a protest isn't surprising to people. And then we think then it might not be that organic. You just see cities in chunks, more like a list. And then we thought about grouping them by regions. So you get a sense of geography. And then we thought about grouping this by states. So because every state had protests, but that will make the page very long. And so we end up landing on this chronological sense that we think the time spread is one big element of it. And then we think going back to what you mentioned, having words come out throughout the photos, make the whole thing more organic piece is better than rather than having chunks like here's Northeast, here's the South, here's the West. And then one big challenge we face is the balance between data and photos, because we both are, sorry, in my apartment. Both are big pieces of this story, the amount of the cities and obviously powerful photos. So we ended up deciding that the photos and the emotion you see in people's faces are more important to the story. And so the maps and the data is there to help proving it. And so the map kind of take a backseat and just comes in and out like 3 or 4 times as you see. And what you're seeing here on the screen is a couple of exploration I did to find the best way to show the population of cities. The big one on the left is what we ended up with. It's like some sizes, circle sizes representing the population, but we don't want the size of circle to be overpowering. So, yeah.
That is, I think the choice you settled on was really good, because I just love how it grows and grows and grows and grows as you're kind of going through, and it builds. And I think if it was regionalized, it just wouldn't have. For me, it would have like sort of broken up the scale of it. But this is just sort of this kind of like unending train of this of these protests.
Yeah, and then actually finding out like the date for the protest was also a challenge. Like the first day when the city started is what we like ended up trying to report on.
I was going to say one other thing is we were able to take, Dawn's data was amazing, and insert some of it in the copy too, in the text, so that, we were giving people a very full story. And so it felt like in doing it that way, we gave people multiple ways to enter the story, both photography, data, and words.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is really speaks to the teachers who are here, because everybody kind of notices different things when they're analyzing something, especially something in the news or something new they're learning about. And I think that gives folks multiple ways to understand this, and multiple things to notice. Okay, so this is more of an open question for all four of you. Is this couldn't have been done in a vacuum with any one person, clearly. So when you're reporting a story like this, so not just putting together this piece, but kind of bringing together this story, what is the collaborative process like? How does it start? How do you, what's the back and forth like? We're very interested to know more about that.
I mean, I can say, I think that this is one of the things actually that the Times has excelled at, especially on the national desk with the graphics and design desks. It starts with someone having an idea, and the way it works is generally you're just pulling people into what used to be a room and is now a digital room, to pick their brains and draw on their skills, and everybody's tossing around ideas and thoughts about things. And it feels like just a giant collaborative brainstorm. And depending on the timing of the piece, often that goes on for a week or so of sort of tossing ideas back and forth and thinking critically about what would serve the reader, what would tell the story best. And then it's sort of like the team kind of hones itself down to the core folks who are going to end up actually working on it, and then you're in constant contact with those people for as long as it takes to produce it. But it is really, I mean, everybody has their fingers in everything else at least a little bit, and it's nice. I think it's not out of place for me to say, oh, I think actually, what about if the design was a little more this way? It's not out of place for Audra to say, hey, I don't know about this photo. What do you think about this? It's like a very, very collaborative, and a nice process generally.
So yeah, a question I had about that is, okay, so this is, I mean, obviously this is a story that is just continuing. It's not, we're not anywhere near the end of something like this, but how do you manage, how do you manage to put together something like this that's sort of like a summary, but also make sure that it's out at a time when people are still really thinking about this, and it's still very on the forefront of people's minds? Because I could just see like you wanting to continue to perfect this and get everything, and get everything perfect, but it takes a while to do something like this. How do you manage that, and how do you sleep?
I can see Dawn grinning because her answer is you don't sleep. I don't sleep.
This project is one of the faster one. I did go through a week of antsy, feeling we should have gotten this faster out. But my editor, Archie and Simone, feel strongly we should do it right instead of do it fast. So that's that. So then the data collection kept going on, and I guess there is a sense of we need to get it out in a timely manner, but also not but we also want a very polished and powerful presentation. So I think the whole thing took about 2 weeks, from the first iterations, first sketches to publishing. So which is a pretty fast production for something like this. And we along the way, we realized we need a designer, so we brought in someone from the design team, and then later on, we realized we need someone who can write through this, and I think Simone reached out to Audra to like really bring this piece together. So it's like this process that this is what we want, and then we bring people in along the way and to make it happen. And yeah, there are 1 or 2 nights we didn't sleep, but.
Was this, and so Audra and John, the two of you clearly collaborate a lot across the country. Was there any difference to doing something like this during this pandemic when everybody's in their separate locations, or was it easier because you didn't have to reserve a room at the Times and battle it out for who got meeting space?
John and I spend a lot of time on the phone discussing stories, emailing back and forth, Slack. I think that this, in my estimation, this project actually proved that it can be done in a remote way and still be incredibly, and still have a great amount of impact. Had we, and keeping in mind that even if we had done this before the pandemic, I'm in Miami, John is in Kansas City, Morrigan, Dawn are in New York. So we still would have been doing it in the same process. We're not all in New York. So I think we're used to we're used to having lots of conversations about things. The other thing, when we talked about collaborating, the original assignment, we want to write about this protest. But in addition to that, in addition to me trying to really capture the emotion, we also needed to look at how this thing lays out. And so there were paragraphs that we were very specific in the way that they were constructed so that they laid at the right place. And so that, I think we were trying to be very deliberate in how we presented it, but also giving people the moment to think about things, think about an image, to pause, and then the next set of words. And so all of that requires doing it together. So I can, I produced a draft, but that draft also had to be shaped to make sure that it was working with the images as well as the graphics themselves.
I just think with collaborations in general, and although I didn't work on this one, I've worked on, others with Audra and others at the Times. It also requires just a lot of trust, I think. Like Audra and I, we trust in each other and each other's abilities. So, when we divvy up calls and interviews we're going to do and who's going to do what for an assignment, and then we kind of just do it, then we come back together and put it together, and kind of, sometimes we'll be looking at a Google Doc together saying, haggling over words and things like that. Other times, it's like one of us will take the lead and the other person will just send them stuff. And so I think there's just this level of trust that you build up. And it's fairly easy at the New York Times, where you have so many great journalists to kind of cede, control or whatever to someone else and just kind of work together on something. And
yeah, I mean, it is a great part about working on the Times, because everybody's so good at what they do. And I am wondering, I feel like I know for our team, there's always has to be at least one person who's sort of like pushing the group along or saying like, okay, this is the day, it's done. Who decides that? Who said, okay, we have the perfect amount of pictures, we have the perfect amount of text, it's flowing well, let's publish?
I think the clock ultimately decided that for us, because we worked right up until the very last minute on this one. But I think Simone, as Dawn referenced, Simone was sort of the driving force on this, and she really kept everything organized and moving in the right direction. She was great.
Okay. All right, so what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go to some teacher questions. So I am going to just call on, I'm gonna call on the teachers and activate their microphone. So teachers, I'm gonna activate your microphone for the question, and then when your question is done, I'm going to turn off the microphone. So we're going to start. So I believe our first question is from Alyssa. So Alyssa Anderson is a social studies teacher in New Jersey.
Hi. My question is, how do you deal with the trauma of what you see and write about, and what strategies do you recommend for like coping with that?
It's interesting. Like we had a lot of these conversations at the Times this year, especially obviously for obvious reasons with COVID and now this. I always wish I had a good answer to this, but I feel like I don't. I feel like for me, it's been the accumulation, I think, of years of covering this stuff, and in some ways, I'm able to somehow silo it. You know, like when I'm at home, you know, with my wife or something like that, you know, and just letting that time be that time. I guess I'm always home with my wife since we're in the pandemic now, but when I'm home and not working, I guess there's kind of like a way for me to silo it. But I mean, I think, you know, for me, I tend to not talk to my, you know, family about it much, but I talk to other journalist friends about stuff that, you know, might you know, that might be traumatic or difficult to talk about. I remember in Minneapolis when I was there that first week, one of my good friends who works for another news organization, I called him and I was just kind of like, you know, it was like the closest I've been to tears, just like covering all this stuff. I'm just like, man, you know, like this is like where do we go from here kind of thing. So I think, you know, confronting it in the way that's comfortable for you. So whether that be talking about it with someone or in some way kind of like channeling that energy somewhere. I think it's healthy to acknowledge it and to acknowledge like what you're seeing and how it makes you feel, rather than just kind of like setting it aside. And obviously there's like the typical, I want to say typical methods in the sense of like, you know, therapy and counseling and whatnot that I personally have not availed myself in these situations for it, but I know that those potentials are there, those opportunities are there if I needed it. So yeah, I think for me, I guess if I just had to boil it down to one main thing, I think it's just being honest with yourself and open about what you're seeing and not trying to like repress it and put it to the side, being honest. And once you're honest with that, then you find the outlet in which you can comfortably kind of let that out, whether that be a friend, family member, or like formal therapy or something like that. Oh, and if I may say one more thing, sorry.
Yeah,
like
sure thing.
For me too, like one thing that this job, I kind of see the importance of us telling these stories. So I think, you know, in times when it's difficult for me, I always kind of think back on that and think back like, yeah, this might be tough for me, but like there are people like out in the streets getting arrested, tear gassed, and getting hit with rubber bullets. And while, you know, like my press pass does some way shields me from that. You know, it doesn't stop you. We've seen journalists get attacked in protests by the police and by other people as well. But to me, it's just knowing the importance of what I'm doing, but also knowing that like there are others who are putting themselves on the line in a very real way in these things. That also kind of keeps me going, I think, when I think about those things.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass things over to Ben Clash. Ben is a ELA teacher, English Language Arts teacher from Beaverton High School in Oregon.
So this question stemmed from the great connections that John made to things like the Rodney King protests and other historical connections, and also the obvious extensive research that the George Floyd protest article had. So my question is, what advice can you give to young writers about making historical connections and performing research in their writing, and how important it is to do that?
I'll take a stab and then John, you can go. I try not to treat any subject matter as in the present. I always assume that there are some historical roots, that there's some, that we have to put it in a historical context. There's just really not that much that is new in terms of the issues themselves. They're long-standing. And so when I'm writing about something in the moment, I am always thinking about when has this happened before? Where has this happened before? And what were the results? Because then we can, you know, you have a way to sort of measure it also. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think similarly, I feel like nothing is new. Sadly, like history repeats itself in ways that are very extraordinary. I remember I was watching on Netflix. This was when I had a weekend off. You know, it was after I was in Minneapolis for 2 weeks straight, and then I had gotten home and I had a weekend off. And on my weekend off, what do? I watched this documentary, LA '92, on Netflix, which is about the Rodney King riots. And there was like some sort of public meeting. It was just one of the quick clips they showed on there, where someone was speaking to like the city council or someone in LA, and this is like 1992, and someone's saying, you know, talking about their experience with the police officer, and they're saying, you know, and the police, something about the police had me, and I can't breathe, you know, they talked about, and I'm like, this is 1992 when this is, you know, someone is talking about not breathing, you know, and so history is always, you know, kind of the guiding principle for all these stories that we write in the present. And it's not to belabor the cliches, but like you can't know how to go forward unless you understand the past, unless you understand the mistakes of the past. And I think understanding like history and what worked and what didn't work in previous iterations of racial justice protests are things that you have to contextualize your writing with, and you have to understand like what things, if you want to know what's changed or what hasn't changed, you have to know how things were in the past. So I think that for every, you know, young writer, I would definitely tell them that when whatever you're writing about now, what parallels can you draw to things that happened in the past? And I would think about it in the context of using that past to kind of gauge where you're at now. So have things changed now? Have things remained the same? Are they similar? Is it somewhere in between? So I'd always kind of like use the history to kind of understand, you know, what this present moment is.
Thank you. We're gonna go to Kim Butterfield. Kim is an English teacher from Central High School in La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Hi. So first of all, I want to say that it's just fascinating to hear about the behind the scenes and how you're putting these huge pieces together. So thank you for offering that to us. But my question is for John and Audra, and I'm thinking about when all of this first started happening and just blowing up in the news, and how information was changing so quickly. The mayor of St. Paul released a statement that like 95% of the people arrested were coming from other states, and then the governor said it was more like 80%, and then that just turned out to be completely false. When you're on the ground, and of course I was thinking about outside agitators and Dr. King being called an outside agitator at one point. And I noticed that you linked to another article that gave that context. So I'm just thinking, when you're on the ground and all of this information is changing so quickly, how do you put together in such a timely fashion, such a balanced article that provides context and is still concise? I just think that seems really challenging. And what's your method? What's your process for that?
I guess I'll jump in first. So I guess the first thing I would say, when you hit the nail on the head when you talk about, you know, the information changing. Like 1 second, you know, the mayor is saying, you know, almost everyone arrested was an outside agitator, quote unquote. But you know, there are a couple things. One, being on the ground, it does give you that insight, like, to really question the official narratives, because you will be there and there are things that will be said that don't make sense. Like, you can be at this protest and you could tell this isn't like if you go to a convention for a city and they're having a big convention, you see all hotels are booked up. You just see that there's a lot of outside people. These are people pulling up in cars and parking on the side of the street and going out to like protests or going out to these things. And this is something you see on the ground. So you're like, this whole sense of outside agitators, it makes no sense. And people you're talking to on the ground, you know, everyone seems to be local. So you'd think that like, if there were all these outside agitators, you'd run into like people, but that's not happening. You know, almost everyone you're encountering on the ground is local. So these are things that automatically, like, on the ground, give you that context when you're seeing things firsthand, seeing things with your own eyes. And so that's why it's really important to be on the ground. But to your other point about like, how are we able to contextualize and get it so concise? So, you know, behind the scenes, you know, to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit, honestly, it's teamwork, right? It's like, you know, I might be out at a scene, but maybe Audra is at home and reporting from home, or one of our other colleagues is reporting from an office or something like that. So it's really that collaboration, that teamwork, knowing that, you know, while I'm out in the field, I can, it may not always be the instance in which I am like going back and looking up all the old, you know, kind of research and stuff from the past and then using that context. But that's why you have colleagues and we're all kind of working together on it. And so that's the important thing, you know, everyone kind of brings the best of what they can with their situation. So when I'm on the ground, I'm bringing the best I can of like what I'm seeing on the ground, what I'm hearing on the ground, what I'm feeling on the ground, what I'm, you know, just what the emotions are. I'm bringing that to the story, while I'll have colleagues who are bringing kind of that 35,000 foot view, that historical, that contextual view. And so it's really this collaboration to put it all together. And that's one thing that happens a lot of times that I think, you know, it's funny, you know, as just a reader growing up, I would have never kind of thought that, but like, you really understand, like, you have to rely on each other.
I'll add to that. Just the short version is precisely as John said, it's teamwork. So there were multiple scenarios during this coverage where John was on the ground, I was getting a governor on the phone, or I was getting a city manager on the phone. We have a research department that was vetting stuff. We're also sending out notes. When we write these big pieces, we're often sending out notes to, you know, dozens of other national reporters saying, hey, we're writing about this. You know, do you know anything about this? Do you have a source on this? Does this sound true? And so we have, I mean, you know, you may see one or two names, but truly these stories, particularly the ones that are that we're crashing on deadline, those are truly team efforts where all of us are trying to contribute to it and make sure that what you get is the best information we have at the time.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Debbie. Debbie, she is a information literacy educator at the City Charter High School. Hi, Debbie.
Hi. My question is for Dawn. With regard to the data and statistics that you were using, where do you get that information? How do you know what sources to trust? I'm asking because as a teacher, it's oftentimes difficult to explain to students how what they look at as numerical data is not being manipulated. So trying to explain that is oftentimes a challenge.
Yeah, so in this research process, we did rely a lot on local media outlets. So what happens if we see a city name, we go back, like search it backwards to see if we can find any credible reports about that city's specific protests. And most of times we find photos that as proof, and those photos obviously will show the scale and show the location. And we found most from local TV stations, and we did rely a lot on those. And we did have a second round of people coming back after the first round of information gathering is done, to go back into those reports and to see if that's really the same city we're talking about. Because sometimes cities have same names in different states, and sometimes the media outlet is not really reliable. So we did have additional people, just a different pair of eyes to have vet the links we put in the sheet. And we did find there are biased reports in some cases. In some cases have like the source isn't very credible. So we did take out those. So it does take a long time to do like 2 rounds of checks on all the information we have, but it was, I think, worth the effort to make sure all that we have is from credible sources. And then sometimes we have like college newspapers, and if we can't verify, we'll call the local media or city hall to verify, did the city have a protest over 100 people.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Nick Stone. He has his hand up. Nick, what's your question?
Hi. So first of all, just thank you all for your work. This is definitely a difficult topic to work through with students, especially when we can't be together in a room. And resources like this have definitely helped a lot. My question, I guess, is for John, but I suppose anyone could answer. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the process of working or maybe not working with editors on headlines and stand firsts. The reason I ask that is, at least with my students, no matter how carefully they read something, the headline is what they remember most. And when I was looking at the example of your work that we were given, you delivered this very nuanced reporting on this issue. And it was preceded by a very blunt headline about, protests spiraling out of control. And of course, from reading it, I didn't get the impression that the protests were spiraling out of control. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there used to be a day in a time in journalism, I should say, when that's something we could always blame on the editors. Oh, the editor wrote the headline. That's not me, right? But now in our new publishing system, relatively new publishing system at the Times, they're asking us to suggest headlines. That headline you said on That's Where I did not do that one. So I can't blame that one on the editors. But yeah, there are times when I, see a headline and I will definitely speak up if I think it does not capture the nuance of the story. Or if I think it's misleading. And if we're being completely honest, it's a very tricky balance, especially now, right? Because we're competing with so many other outlets around the world, on this vast space called the internet, to get people to why is this the story you should read about, about these protests? Why is this the one you should read? And so you want to get something that will draw people in, that will let readers know that they're going to get something from this story they may not get elsewhere, or there's a compelling reason to. And it's a tricky balance, honestly. And for me, it's a lot of touch and go and just experimentation. And there's, sometimes there's back and forth with the editors, other times not as much, because, there are times like this one, the story you just referenced, that was one where there was actually an early version of the story that went into the earlier versions of the newspaper. And then as the story evolved through the night, it was changed. And at that point, it's like deadline. And so I'm not even really seeing that, I'm not even seeing that until the end. But when you can, you definitely want to have those conversations. And I'm sure Audra probably has had these conversations as well.
Well, and as John mentioned, in our new system, it's our responsibility to take the first sort of swipe at the headline, and writers generally get them wrong, but we do try. And but the headlines are the subject of conversations, not unlike the words that we use in the story. We have this sort of back and forth with editors about if it's capturing it, if it feels like it's too much, like it's not, if there's a disconnect between the copy and the headline, if it doesn't go far enough. And there are occasions when we actually change the headline too. It can be changed even after it's gone online. If it feels like it just is not connecting in the way it should, or that it's not as accurate as it should be.
Thank you very much. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I'm gonna, Erin Pinsky has a question. Erin.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your time. I teach high school social studies, and so you've excited me by your discussion about how much of what you report on is certainly grounded in the history, and I can't wait to share with my students that it's not just me saying that. But I actually had a question related to the photographs specifically. You all have spoken about kind of the confluence of the words and the photos and the graphics and the data. But I'm most curious to know how any or all of you might respond to how you envision these photographs being used in classrooms and how you would hope students engage with them. I'd be really curious to know, as kind of the creators yourselves, what would you most hope for us educators to do with them?
I have probably the nerdiest answer to that, which is just more from a photojournalism standpoint. I think that this is a really interesting example of how to show the same thing multiple times without it getting boring, and with each photo showing something different. it's sort of, I actually was an English major in college. I studied poetry, and I often think of photography as a poem, and each photo, contains these elements of a story, and they're just compacted in this small visual way. And I think it's this piece in particular is an interesting piece to talk about how you tell a story in a photo, how you tell a story through a huge series of photos that are ostensibly all showing the same thing. So that's my very nerdy photo answer for you. But
And I'm gonna add from a graphics editor's standpoint that we deal with data a lot, and photos in this piece kind of humanize the data. That without the photos, this map would just be dots on a map. It wouldn't mean anything. And in our work, that's always a struggle because we are telling a human story. And I think in this case, the photos really shows you directly the human aspect and the scale of this movement.
I think it goes both ways. I think, something like this couldn't have been done with just a stack of photos, because we wouldn't have been able to accurately show the scale. We talked about the map kind of taking a back seat in some ways visually to the photos, but I think it was incredibly important to have that there because you needed to be able to see the scale in a way that, like, we just can't show you that many photos. Will crash your computer too, along with all of ours. So I think that's that the balance of the map and of Audra's words as well and the photos was really crucial in this particular, to show the scale. I don't think it could have been done another way.
Thank you. I'm gonna, I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna call on Michael Potter. Michael.
Hi, I'm gonna ask a question for everybody, which is, do you feel, does your reporting say that you have to continue to advocate to your editors that this story still has legs, like weeks and months after the initial incident, that this is something you should, still be paying attention to? And then for John, being on the ground, did you feel a stress, or maybe even it was just nice that you had, or did you have to interview a lot of different people on the protesting side to ensure that you got enough of a view of how everybody was feeling? Because there's no like national organizations speaking on behalf of the protesters. There's not like flack or talking points that they're trying to get, just to make sure that everybody was given a fair shake.
I'll take the first part of the question. George Floyd died on the evening of Memorial Day, and within a week, as we saw this thing get bigger and bigger, and it was truly resonating, we had multiple conversations with the editors who said, this feels like a moment of our lifetime, and we ought to be looking at this with the long lens. And so we were obviously covering this day to day. We had a live briefing, we did daily stories, but at that point we were also beginning to think long term, and we have multiple projects that are coming that are dealing with George Floyd and what he represents, and systemic issues that will go throughout the year, maybe next year too. So early on, I think it was clear that we needed to be committed to this long term.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that totally. And regarding on the ground, I think, but I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I don't think it's just with this story. I think it's with any story. You always want to get a sense of as many voices as you can, as many people. And the interesting thing about this one is that I think the more you talk to people, this kind of gets you to what you see in this great piece that that Morrigan, Audra, and Dawn worked on here is the diversity, the breadth, and the scope of the protests. Because I'll be talking to there was a couple I spoke to. They're both, I think, 54. They were immigrants, I want to say from Ethiopia, if I remember correctly. and they talked about, this was their first time protesting. This is worse than anything they'd seen, in their home country. And how they were scared for their son to come out and protest, but they were okay for their daughter because they were scared about a black male protesting versus a black woman. You talk to, I talked to white young people who were out there. Like one woman, she had a black son. I believe she was a white woman with a black son, and talked about, how this is our fight too. There was another woman, I think she was Eastern European, and she talked about, how she came from a war-torn region herself, and so what she's seeing here is war. So I think the more you talk to people, you get this view that is really beautifully captured in this piece that we've been talking about here, which is the breadth and the scope of it. And so I think that only comes by persistence and by just like talking to as many people as possible and understanding like what brings people there and kind of what this moment means for people.
Thank you so much. So I'll ask one more question, and then I think we can, and then I think we'll say goodbye if you all had time. I would just love to maybe hear from each of you, as our teachers prepare to go back to school, either virtually or in person, hopefully in the safest way possible, what do you hope, how do you hope they engage with their students on this? How do you, what are you hoping that students are coming out of this story with and continuing to work on this year and as they continue in middle school and high school?
I'm hopeful that they can see that they can see the arc from it being a moment to a movement, and that this movement would not have happened without history, and that you can't really have this conversation about George Floyd or police brutality or systemic racism without having the conversation about the historical roots in America. This is an American story.
Thank you.
And I think this is more like all this protests and everything is a starting point of changes and conversations to happen. And going back a little bit to the earlier conversation, the earlier question, I think graphics specifically now we're still very interested in this topic, but not we're steering away from the protest point of view, but more like all about the police reform, all the police violence and the racial injustice, like stepping back to a bigger picture topics and see where we can contribute to the reporting of those bigger issues. And I think those conversations were going on for a very, very long time, and it's very necessary.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Morgan. Sorry.
I was going to say, to piggyback on that, I think it's a really interesting moment to be talking about how we tell the stories about our country for the future, and how we talk about things like racial injustice in this country, and make sure that we are accurately portraying and using all of the resources at our disposal to be able to tell these stories and do the most justice with them. I think this is a really interesting time to be doing that as it's sort of being lived as a country altogether.
And I guess what I would say is that this, while we've talked about history repeating itself, I do think this is a unique moment when you look at polling. I don't think you've seen this level of support for issues of racial justice, like maybe ever. Something like 71% of the country supports or agrees that, Black Americans face racial injustice. There was a Monmouth poll on that. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what it was. But the point being that, I would hope that you all would challenge your students, it's their generation, that now that people actually understand where we're starting from, understand the baseline by and large, what are the actual things that are going to be done to create systemic change, right? What are, we've had these conversations, we can have all the Zoom panels all we want, and what can they do? How can they reflect on what they can do so that, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the Zoom panel is not about, oh, we all understand this is a problem, let's talk about it. But it's wow, the world is different now than it was, on July 14th, 2020, when, this over the hill journalist who's sitting here talking about this stuff, you know. So it's like, what can they actually do, and their generation do, to actually create this systemic change?
I think that's I think that's a really great line to end on, because I think we have a group of 60 teachers who are here who are who have been doing that work and are really excited to continue doing that. So I just want to thank you on behalf of all of them. I don't have an applause machine in my home office, but I think everybody's sort of virtually applauding. So thank you all for taking the time today to speak to us, and stay safe. Hopefully you can get some rest, and thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.